Net zero pledges failing at the operational level. When net zero targets were set, many of them between 2020 and 2022, they were built on a set of assumptions about what the infrastructure environment would look like by 2030. Grid capacity would expand, renewable energy would become cheaper and more accessible. Electrification would be a straightforward technical path. The interconnection queue would move. None of those assumptions turned out to be wrong exactly. But the pace was off, and the bottlenecks were underestimated. Accenture finds just 16% of the 2,000 largest companies by revenue are currently on track for net zero by 2050. That's not a failure of ambition, it's a failure of operational planning. For the facilities and energy managers who have to execute against those commitments, the gap between what was promised and what's actually buildable is the defining tension of 2026. The strategy is still on the wall. The operational reality is a grid connection queue that spans roughly 700 to 800 gigawatts, equivalent to powering the UK annually, about 20 times over. That's not a planning abstraction. That's the physical environment in which decarbonization has to happen. The wall's operations is running into grid congestion, and interconnection delays are the most visible obstruction. Projects that assumed 2-year timelines for grid connection are looking at 5 or more. That delay compounds across a capital plan. A renewable energy project that was supposed to be operational by 2027 and eliminate a third of a facility's Scope 2 emissions is now a 2030 conversation at best. The commitment is still on record. The labor gap is the blocker that gets less attention than it deserves, and it's arguably more constraining than the technology. In the UK, there are roughly 4,000 qualified heat pump installers against an estimated need of 150,000. Similar shortfalls exist across HVAC and building electrification trades in the US. Projects aren't being delayed because the capital isn't there or the technology doesn't work. They're being delayed because the crews aren't available. That's not a temporary bottleneck. It's a structural constraint that takes years to build through training and workforce development, longer than most decarbonization timelines assumed. Scope 3 accounting accuracy is the third pressure point, and it creates a particularly difficult communication problem. Facilities leaders are often responsible for tracking not just direct operational emissions, but the full supply chain footprint of materials, equipment, and services they procure. That accounting depends on data from suppliers who are at wildly different stages of measurement maturity. The result? A company can genuinely be reducing its operational footprint while its reported Scope 3 numbers increase, because the measurement is improving, not because the performance is getting worse. Explaining that upward is one of the quieter challenges in the space, and most operations teams haven't built the language for it yet. What operations can actually control? The risk in any honest assessment of operational gaps is that it gets read as a case for lowering ambition. That's not the argument. The argument is for more realistic transition planning that maps commitments against the actual infrastructure constraints, and that builds contingencies for what happens when those constraints don't resolve on schedule. What facilities and energy leaders can control in the near term: energy efficiency measures that don't depend on grid infrastructure, insulation, process heat optimization, compressed air systems, LED lighting. These produce verifiable results now and reduce the baseline from which electrification needs to start. On-site generation and storage, where permitting is local rather than utility dependent, can accelerate timelines. And demand management programs that reduce peak load exposure protect operations against grid stress events that are projected to increase as summer temperatures rise. The broader question for operations is where to invest audit and documentation effort. If the commitments are on record and the enforcement environment around environmental claims is tightening, the operational documentation that shows genuine progress, even when it falls short of interim targets, is more valuable than silence. Companies that can demonstrate a credible transition trajectory with honest accounting of infrastructure constraints are in a better position than companies that simply carry forward commitments that aren't being delivered against. The reporting cycle is coming. Q2 is often the inflection point where companies doing mid-year reviews of their capital and operational plans have to make honest assessments about what's achievable in the near term. For facilities and energy leaders, that review should include a clear-eyed mapping of which commitments are on track, which are constrained by infrastructure or supply availability, and which need to be escalated to the sustainability and communications functions for proactive investor messaging. The gap between commitment and delivery is real. The companies that get ahead of it, with honest operational documentation and proactive framing, will have better conversations. The ones who don't will be managing the same gap in a more adversarial context. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.